Hi everyone, my name is Shelvi Vaklu. I go by the she, her pronouns. Today, we'll be diving into planning for intersectionality to make sure no woman is left behind. Currently, I am the Senior Director of Data at Strava. I've spent more than 7 years in management roles, and I've spent my entire career building products for very wide audiences. Intersectionality is a topic I began researching a few years ago, starting with my own experience. Over time, I've collected some nuggets that helped me make more sense of it and put together my own plan for action. I hope all of you who chose to drop in for this talk today know how deep your impact can be on positive outcomes for marginalized groups in tech. Some of these outcomes are internal for the people who work in tech, and some of these outcomes are external through the products that we launch. Hopefully, by the end of the talk, you have a good idea for how you can plan to support intersectional experiences. Today, we'll first take a look at understanding intersectionality, learn about the ways in which it shows up, and some examples of issues that it can cause. And finally, how we can start to address some of those issues. So, first up, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. She gave a very popular TED talk that was published in 2016, where she said that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. These injustices cannot be solved by addressing only one of the causes. For example, the marginalization of women is well understood and documented. The marginalization of Black people is documented. But there are unique problems that Black women face, which has not historically been well documented. Understanding, acknowledging, and addressing these problems, which are greater than the sum of its parts, is a lot of what her efforts have focused on. Her talk sparked a lot more research on the topic and also led to the creation of many more data points than were previously available. This helped improve the understanding of those compounding effects that she talked about. For all of you visual learners, here is another way to think about the concept. First, let's think of various shapes, each of which may represent the problem that are faced by a single identity. In this example, I have 3 shapes representing gender, race, and age. There can be many more shapes representing more identities. Now let's overlap some of these shapes. These overlapping now represent the problems faced by that intersecting identity. For example, the problems you face as a woman who is older, or as a woman of color, or as an older woman of color. Here again, there are many more combinations, and I have only used the base combinations that intersect with gender from the existing identities or shapes that we were looking at. Let's now add another level of complexity, which represents the space where somebody might face issues, and that is being depicted by a specific color. People face issues in the workplace, in the healthcare system, or in the legal system. Again, there can be many more colors representing many more spaces. And finally, putting it all together, we have overlapping shapes where the overlap has a particular color. This represents the problems faced by an intersectional identity in a particular space. This helps us think about what problems older women face in the workplace, or what problems women of color face in healthcare, and the problems older women of color might face in the legal system. Here again, there could be many more combinations than what I've listed. The colors for each of the overlaps can change as you explore a different space. With that, I will anchor that today I'm going to focus on the base demographic of women within the various intersections. So if we go back to the shape analogy, in the overlaps, at least one of those shapes will be gender. I'm anchoring this conversation to women, which includes trans women, not to in any way diminish the experience of other intersectionalities, but rather to speak from my own experience for a demographic that I have been able to research more effectively. Overall, I hope that these learnings could be applicable across other intersectionalities. For me, it helped pursue my goal of leaving no woman behind, which is where I feel I can have the most impact. I hope in general this can spark ideas about ways to be inclusive. Another way to understand intersectionality, I'd love to share the story of Sojourner Truth. She was a famed American abolitionist and women's rights activist. She had a lot of impact on both those movements during the mid 1800s. If you've heard a lot more about Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist as well, and Susan B. Anthony, who was a women's rights activist, that's not a coincidence. Truth and Douglass worked together on anti slavery efforts, while Truth and Anthony collaborated on women's rights. In both of those cases, she was dedicating herself towards justice for the marginalized. However, neither of those movements fully elevated her contributions or gave her equity in the outcome. She was contributing to the success of both movements, but the groups didn't really optimize for her experience and bluntly declared that she was second priority. In the abolitionist movement, she was the inferior female voice, and in the suffragette movement, she was the racial minority. This is one of the many examples that helps explain why, till today, we see such poor outcomes for women of color, especially Black women in our society. Inherently, we keep deprioritizing the need of the marginalized within the marginalized. Both movements she participated in were fighting for justice. However, neither bothered to explicitly include fighting for justice for Black women. It was just like she said that the rich rob from the poor and the poor rob one another. That faulty mindset that somehow there just aren't enough resources to go around so that all marginalized identities can seek justice is something that unfortunately continues till today. As we saw in the case of Miss Truth, even marginalized identities can sometimes marginalize other identities. This brings us to the concept of exploring our own privilege. We're very used to thinking of ourselves in this very binary way of either having or not having privilege. But the reality is that we all have some areas where we benefit from social dominance and other areas where we experience marginalization. Using whatever privilege we have for the benefit of others who don't have that same privilege is how we keep the world moving forward towards more equity. This list of dimensions along which you may or may not have privilege is non exhaustive. But do take a moment to look at these identities. Think about yourself and the people in your life. How many people do you interact with that belong to a different identity? Do you understand their challenges? And if you don't, how can you educate yourself? And lastly, where can you acknowledge that you have privilege? What can you do with that privilege? Note that some identities are more visible than others. We are way more likely to notice someone's gender or race or age immediately than know about their religion, education, or economic status. Based on what we identify quickly, our biases can actually be very different. Some identities are also more prone to bias than other identities. And some identities are immutable, while others can change over time. All of this is hopefully a prompt to think more about these things. I examined my own privilege and highlighted the ones where I think I get a benefit from that identity. People, for example, may question my credentials or be more suspicious of me because of my non dominant race, gender, or nationality. But the fact that I'm a healthy, college educated, 30 something person living in San Francisco means that I have more opportunities than many others. My location, for example, has directly had a positive effect on my economic status. This awareness of understanding where I have privilege has been helpful for me to put things in perspective. And it has also helped me decide where to focus my efforts when I want to show up as an ally. Let's now examine a few ways that problems show up that are caused by intersectionality. I'm choosing to highlight issues as they show up in the space of the workplace. Workplace is, of course, a place where outcomes can have vast influence on the rest of your life because it directly affects your economic status, healthcare, legal rights, etc. I am choosing a few intersections and I'm by no means stack ranking them in any way or creating an exhaustive list. I am speaking about the topics that I had some degree of connection to or the ones that I was able to better research. The pay gap is something that often comes up when we talk about equity in the workplace. It is well known that women only earn 82 cents to every $1 that a man earns. While that stat is kind of sad on its own, what it hides is that the data is much worse when you break it down by race. By race, it is easy to see that if you are not white or not an Asian woman as I am, your salary outcomes are actually much, much worse than the 82 cents that people hear about. By hiding the nuances of the data, it is easy to see how so many people may miss the demographic for which the burden is the largest. In the workplace, gender identity can also lead to much more discrimination if you are trans woman or non binary. Oftentimes, the healthcare options available through our employers provide inadequate coverage to women that don't meet their needs for maternity, for example. For trans women, it gets even worse, as they have medically required treatments or mental health options which may not be covered. Trans women have a 44% chance of being diagnosed with clinical depression, so the lack of good healthcare access can be very dire for them. Besides that, many other problems that women face in the workplace, like harassment, which can be sexual or verbal in nature, are almost always worse for trans women and non binary, who really shouldn't have to put up with a hostile work environment. Microaggressions in the form of misgendering, belittling, and decreased access to opportunities are also big problems that they face. For women in the workplace who are immigrants, there are also additional problems that they might encounter. They could face an increased risk for deportation, and they will continue to face difficulties navigating the legal system that doesn't inherently grant them consistent protections. 13% of the women living in the US are immigrants. Their participation in the labor force, how much they earn, what kind of job they have, all of that can be affected by their immigration status. They may be fearful and face isolation due to their status. This leads to much higher tolerance for abuse that employers may eventually exploit. This is especially pronounced for undocumented immigrants, though documented immigrants also routinely face explicit or implicit threats from employers, partners, landlords, and so on. Overall, immigrant women have less opportunities to find meaningful work and fair counsel in a system that already fails women by being too slow and inadequate in its capacity to address injustices. Religion is another one of those attributes that I feel should have no bearing on women's success at work, but unfortunately, it ends up playing a role. Employers or sometimes entire industries can occasionally be really hesitant to make simple workplace accommodations that end up meaning that women of a certain religion may have even less opportunities available to them than other women of a dominant religion. Some of them may need very light flexibility with the time or the day of the week or even the season. Others may have a need for greater privacy or prefer to wear clothes that are not part of an official uniform. And some might need help navigating nuances that are more cultural than purely religious in nature. There is also the issue of belonging and how much othering people face at their job. If all bonding events, for example, are geared around something like a barbecue or a happy hour that women of certain religions may not feel comfortable participating in, then it can become isolating for them and eventually result in lower job performance. The last intersection in the workplace I'll cover is education background. It is commonplace for jobs to have an over-indexing on traditional skills that are not actually even a good predictor of job performance. Some jobs require advanced degrees or just list a bunch of skills that are required, and Men might actually apply to those skills regardless, but a lot of women tend to self select out if they don't meet all the requirements. This happens way more often for women with non traditional education background, as they may feel an imposter syndrome in a space that doesn't seem theirs to begin with. If they do apply and actually get the job, their positioning at work might still remain very biased, with people assuming that maybe their boot camp credentials are in some way inferior to a traditional education. Such biases are not true, and they are very harmful to the women who didn't have access to educational opportunities but have still persevered and found ways to catch up on relevant skills for the jobs that they're interested in. For all of these examples, things like this can show up in the workplace even before someone is hired. If a woman is applying for a job, many times prospective employers will make explicit and implicit assumptions about her skills or her experiences and competencies due to bias. All of that can affect her chances of getting a job. If she also happens to be a woman of color, her personal appearances might be judged because they are a deviation from the norm. And if she also happens to be someone with a disability, the chances of how accommodating her employer is likely to be will go down dramatically, especially if the employer feels they're already well outside their comfort zone. These were some of the many examples of how different intersections cause show up in different settings. Some of these may be familiar to you, or maybe you know someone who faces them. But think about your own role in these conversations of privilege. Where do you fit in for specific identities? You might be marginalized, where you are actually affected by the bias. And in that case, your priority is to try to solve it for yourself and, when possible, document it for others. You might be an ally, in which case you yourself are in a position of privilege in a given situation and you can do the work to fix it for others. You'll be penalized a lot less and, in fact, probably praised if you are selflessly solving it for someone else. And finally, there is the chance that you are, in fact, the perpetrator. In some way, you are amplifying the problems faced by those not in power. You're either doing this directly or indirectly when you choose to not decenter yourself in a problem. So you have to have the self-awareness to admit that even if you are marginalized on one identity, you can still make things worse for other identities. And so in such a situation, if you are not the victim, then who do you want to be today? In order to prioritize the needs of the marginalized, we have to come up with and put in a place a plan of action that is both inclusive and intentional. We can no longer claim ignorance of us or our subgroups of people to wait their turn while we focus on the biggest groups of the marginalized sections. To address this, I turn to the philosophy of a man I really admire. This is Mahatma Gandhi, the world's first practitioner of the principle of nonviolence on a large-scale political field. He dedicated his life to advocating for the marginalized, promoting harmony, and pursuing truth. In one of the last notes he left behind before his assassination, he wrote, "Whenever you're in doubt, recall the face of the poorest person and ask yourself if the step you contemplate will be of any use to them." This is a wonderful way to think about our own actions and practice the philosophy of prioritizing the needs of the most disadvantaged first. We are faced with a lot of choices, especially in cases where we have some privilege. When deciding how to respond to those choices, why not pause and think about how our choices would not just impact our future, but the future of those who are most vulnerable, those who don't have a seat at the table and are hoping you'll use your seat to advocate for them. Based on that philosophy, I propose a 3-step plan to solve for intersectionality. The 3 steps are awareness, acknowledgement, and action. Awareness is the first step to solve any challenge. If we don't see it and if we don't understand it, we can't fix it. By default, it is hard to be aware of all the problems that exist, especially the problems that don't affect us directly. So how can we proactively build our awareness? We can consciously build our empathy. We can learn from people with different identities and try to understand their perspective and build empathy. When we are surrounded by people from similar backgrounds, we don't get the chance to hear a different perspective. Seek out people who are different from you and ask them to share their experience if they are open to that. Go to conferences and meetups that focus on challenges for specific identities, especially if those spaces welcome allies to learn and engage. Honestly, even reading the agenda of what was discussed at an event for a different demographic can help you start building curiosity. And be genuine with your curiosity without being intrusive. Next, we can intentionally find and fix the flaws. Engineers are used to this. This is a common practice for us to break our own code. If you're making a decision, look for loopholes. Play devil's advocate and see how your decision can unravel, and think of all the things that can go wrong. Sometimes the things that can go wrong are all the more likely to be a problem that certain demographics encounter. In which case, it's not really that something is wrong, but rather that your solution doesn't account for all the use cases. Knowing that upfront can help you decide what, if anything, you'd like to do about it. Another way to build awareness is to intentionally go out and look for the data. A lot of common issues that occur are well documented, and there's usually data available online to back up and quantify the individual problems. Even if there's no specific information available for a particular identity that you're curious about, it helps to start thinking and proactively looking for some of that information. Even related topics and data can be useful in thinking about the problem and identifying common places where the system fails. Quantitative data can help show the problem in aggregate, and qualitative data can help you find the niche concerns that people are bringing up. The next step in the plan for intersectionality is acknowledgement. One part of that is to just acknowledge and state the status quo. When you see something, say something. As you observe and become aware of how discrimination may show up, find ways to explicitly highlight those observations. You, as an ally, can have the capacity to not face the consequences that usually come with highlighting an injustice. And that's a privilege you can use for the benefit of others. The other part of acknowledgement is to acknowledge and admit your own gaps. We are never going to be in a position to know about every single nuance, and there are some areas where we would have spent zero time thinking about that problem. This is not unusual, and you should not be embarrassed about that. Instead, you should recognize that you have a lack of exposure and be upfront about it, that you are learning, and try whenever possible to show genuine but non-intrusive curiosity. People who you are trying to learn from will appreciate that vulnerability and will be more inclined to spend the time getting you up to speed. If you are worried about offending someone, just be upfront and say that you are trying to learn and that you just don't have enough knowledge and you're trying to ask. People rarely get mad at folks who show a genuine willingness to learn and grow, but never insist that somebody be in charge of your education and put in the effort to do that yourself. The final step is to consolidate all your learnings and go into problem-solving mode. What can you do today as an ally to help marginalized identities and show up for other people? As you think of solutions, find ways to hold yourself accountable by creating SMART goals. Focus on measurable outcomes rather than just a general nudging towards equity. Your commitment and perseverance towards building equity will be important to the marginalized groups for whom you are an ally. It is also a good idea to include other people in your journey to create equity for all groups. Share your learnings, ask people to chime in with their thoughts, and brainstorm solutions. There is a lot of talent to be utilized within your network to come up with creative solutions, and it is always a good idea to learn and do as a community while seeking diverse perspectives. To wrap it all up, if we want everyone to have equity, we can't wait. If the community we build isn't inclusive, even if we are marginalized, we'd still be no better than those who have marginalized us. We need to keep advocating for justice and fairness and pushing for everyone to have an equal chance at success. Thank you all for prioritizing planning for intersectionality and making sure that no woman is left behind. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Even after today, if you want to reach out and share your observations, I would absolutely welcome that. Just wanted to share a couple of references that I used today as part of my research. If you need the links, find me on Twitter. There's a lot of interesting reading out there. And thank you again for listening. I hope that this talk resonated and that you have some useful takeaways. Please do share comments and questions that you might have, including any personal stories that you are open to sharing. I'm also available on Twitter, and my website contains the videos of all my talks. Thank you so much.